The sun was slipping below the horizon when a low rumble began to echo across the quiet farmland. In the distance, headlights flickered through a rising cloud of dust like a storm creeping in. Inside the modest farmhouse, Mara Johnson crouched by the window, her weathered hands steady as she slid open a worn rifle case she had hoped she'd never touch again. The gang racing toward her property thought they were about to terrorize a lone black woman in an isolated field. What they didn't know was that Mara was no ordinary farmer. Her past, buried for decades, was about to resurface, because tonight, survival demanded it. For 20 years, Mara Johnson had lived in peace on the outskirts of Willow Creek. In this small farming town, the lines of poverty and prejudice were drawn as visibly as the roads that split the fields. Her farm had been her sanctuary, rows of corn and soybeans, a few barns, and the old farmhouse her father had built. The land had been in her family for generations, surviving droughts, floods, and the cruelty of history. But peace had always felt fragile. In town, whispers followed her. Some dismissed her as a reclusive widow, while others still carried old resentments toward her family's success. She bore it silently, keeping her focus on the soil and the seasons. What no one in Willow Creek truly remembered, or chose to forget, was that long before she became a farmer, Mara had served her country. She had been one of the first black women recruited into a special reconnaissance unit during a war overseas. Her skills as a marksman had saved lives more times than anyone could count. But she had left that world behind decades ago, trading the battlefield for open skies and quiet harvests. Trouble had been brewing for weeks. A local extremist gang, emboldened by online hate and fueled by rumors of land disputes, began harassing black farmers in the county. They scrawled slurs on barns, shot at fences, and left burning trash at the edge of fields. The sheriff promised to investigate, but little was done. Mara tried to believe it would pass her by, until the night she saw the convoy of trucks tearing up the dirt road toward her home. As the engines roared closer, she knew the past she had buried would not stay silent any longer. The gang came in numbers, their pickup trucks forming a rough semicircle near the outer field. Dust and exhaust hung in the air like a storm cloud. Shouts carried across the farmland, taunting and jeering, as if the farm they approached were theirs for the taking. Mara watched from the farmhouse window. Her heart was steady, but in her chest a long-forgotten discipline awoke. She thought of her father, who had taught her to plant seeds and mend fences, and of the soldiers she had once trained alongside, men and women who had trusted her eyes to find the unseen threat on distant ridgelines. She didn't want to fight. All she had wanted was to live in peace, but she also knew that retreat would invite only worse harm. She moved methodically, locking the doors and shutting off the exterior lights so her house wouldn't be an easy target. Then she climbed the narrow ladder to the attic and opened the hatch to the slanted roof. Outside, the gang spread out on foot, emboldened by the darkness and the distance from the sheriff's patrol. They believed they were hunting a vulnerable target. What they saw was an isolated farm, a single light blinking inside a weathered farmhouse. They didn't see the years of training behind the stillness in the shadows above. Mara lay flat against the shingles, the old rifle resting on the ridge. Her eye traced the line of trucks. She could hear their crude laughter, even a few mocking shouts about driving her off their land. Rage sparked inside her, but she tamped it down. Rage clouded judgment, and tonight called for clarity. As the gang edged closer, their taunts turned to threats. One of them raised a torch, waving it toward her barn. Another shouted that no one would stop them this time. The night air felt charged, like a taut string ready to snap. Mara breathed slowly, her mind focusing not on vengeance but on protection of her land, of the memory of her family who had endured so much for the right to call this soil theirs. She remembered a lesson from her old commander. Sometimes the best defense is simply refusing to yield. In the distance, headlights appeared again, just faint beams at first. She knew it was the sheriff's delayed response, too far to reach her in time. Until they arrived, the stand she made would be her own. The first bottle shattered against the barn wall, flames licking at the dry boards. That was the moment Mara's restraint snapped. With a calm born of years in service, she shifted her position and fired a warning shot into the dirt just feet from the man with the torch. The crack of the rifle split the night, startling the gang. Several dove for cover behind their trucks. A tense standoff followed. The gang had come expecting to intimidate and burn, not to face a trained defender. Mara's shots were measured, each one aimed not to kill, but to pin them down and keep them at bay. She targeted tires, headlights, the dirt at their feet, using every bullet as a statement. This farm would not be surrendered. Shouts rose among them, some urging retreat, others cursing her defiance. Another tried to rush forward. A single crack of the rifle sent him sprawling in the dust, unharmed but frozen by the near miss. The farmyard became a battlefield of will rather than blood. The flames at the barn sputtered out as the man with the torch scrambled back to safety. The advance stalled. For the first time, fear flickered across the gang's faces. They were not fighting the stereotype they had conjured in their hatred. They were facing a woman whose resolve and skill made their bluster meaningless. Then the distant wail of sirens cut through the night. Flashing blue and red lights streaked along the road, growing brighter. The sheriff's convoy was finally on its way. Some of the gang members bolted for their trucks, peeling out across the field in clouds of dust. A few stayed longer, shouting threats they didn't dare to act on. By the time the deputies arrived, the raiders were in full retreat, leaving behind their scattered torches and burned-out bravado. Mara lowered her rifle as the vehicles approached. Her arms trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had carried for so many years. She had fought only to defend her home, yet the echoes of her past had returned all the same. Dawn came quietly, washing the fields in soft gold. The sheriff's team combed the property, collecting evidence from the gang's discarded weapons and tire tracks. Neighbors began to arrive, some shocked, some ashamed for having dismissed Mara as just a quiet farmer. They saw in her not only a survivor, but a protector. Reporters arrived later that week requesting interviews. Mara refused most of them. She wasn't interested in being a headline. She only wanted the town to understand that silence in the face of hatred invites tragedy. The sheriff admitted publicly that his earlier inaction had emboldened the gang and pledged a more vigilant watch. For the community, the incident became a turning point. The myth of the helpless, isolated farmer was shattered. So, too, was the complacency that had let hatred fester unchallenged. Conversations began in churches, schools, and council meetings about the need for real support for marginalized families in rural areas, and for firm action against groups that preyed on them. On her porch one evening, Mara watched the sunset burnish the horizon. The land she had defended was still hers, but she knew that the battle wasn't just about a farm. It was about a history that stretched back generations, about dignity that could not be stripped away by fear. She thought about the young people in town, especially those who had seen the night's events on the news. She hoped they understood that courage sometimes looks like holding your ground with restraint. That true strength lies in defending what is right without losing your humanity. Her story was no longer a secret, and perhaps that was for the best. By standing her ground, Mara had forced a reckoning. The question that lingered in the minds of many who heard her story was simple, yet profound. How many more voices, buried under the weight of prejudice, must be forced to rise before we listen?